Chapter 01 The Enemy That Couldn't Die. January 8, 1966. Cu Chi District, South Vietnam. The jungle northwest of Saigon is on fire. 8,000 American soldiers from the 1st Infantry Division and the Royal Australian Regiment have just launched Operation Crimp, the largest search and destroy mission of the Vietnam War to that date. Their orders: find the Viet Cong command infrastructure operating in Cu Chi District and destroy it completely. The bombers came first, then the artillery, then the infantry, moving through a landscape reduced to smoking craters and splintered bamboo. They find almost nothing: no command posts, no weapons caches large enough to matter, no enemy formation they can fix and destroy. And yet, within hours of the sweep, mortar rounds begin falling on their positions from coordinates that were bombed flat that same morning. The enemy is not retreating. The enemy is not hiding in the jungle. The enemy is underneath the soldiers' boots, and they don't know it yet. Chapter 02250 kilometers straight down, Cu Chi Province, South Vietnam. The United States military in 1965 was the most technologically advanced fighting force in the history of warfare. It had Bi-52 stratofortresses capable of carpet bombing entire grid squares into rubble. It had the UH-1 Iroquois helicopter, the iconic Huey, giving infantry mobility that no guerrilla force could match. It had acoustic ground sensors, infrared cameras, and chemical detection aircraft, machines that could, in theory, smell a human being from 500 feet in the air. General William C. Westmoreland, commanding the Military Assistance Command Vietnam from his headquarters in Saigon, had declared a strategy of attrition. Body count was the metric. The Americans would kill faster than the enemy could replace. The math, on paper, was unassailable. Cu Chi District was 25 miles northwest of Saigon, so close to the capital that Westmoreland's staff called it strategically intolerable. The Iron Triangle, as they named it, was among the most heavily bombed regions in the history of armed conflict. Between 1965 and 1975, the area received more explosive ordnance per square kilometer than any comparable zone in the Second World War. And beneath all of it, beneath the craters, beneath the burned jungle, beneath the villages that had been relocated and then burned again, was a tunnel network more than 250 kilometers long. 3 underground levels, hospitals, weapons factories, printing presses producing revolutionary newspapers, conference rooms where strategy was debated while American bombs detonated 30 feet above the ceiling. The tunnels had taken 20 years to build. They would take 10 more years to finish the war. Chapter 03 The Woman Who Lived Underground, 1965 to 1968. Cu Chi Tunnels, South Vietnam. Her name was Vo Thi Mo, born in Cu Chi Province. A farmer's daughter, she joined the National Liberation Front in her early 20s and became one of the most decorated fighters of the Tunnel War. She is credited with destroying 3 American armored vehicles operating from positions that American forces had already declared cleared. Vo Thi Mo was not exceptional because of her ideology. She was exceptional because of what she could endure. Inside the tunnels of Cu Chi, she slept in chambers barely wide enough to turn over in. She breathed recycled air that tasted of earth, kerosene smoke, and the chemical residue of whatever ordnance had just struck overhead. She moved at night, above ground, in civilian clothing, crossing American checkpoints with weapons components disassembled and hidden beneath baskets of vegetables. She was a farmer in the daylight. She was a soldier in the dark. And in the darkness, she was invisible. Vo Thi Mo was awarded the title Hero of the People's Armed Forces, the highest military honor the North Vietnamese government could bestow. The Americans never knew her name. They could not find her. They could not find anyone. That was the point. In a war decided by visibility, the tunnel fighters had made themselves disappear. Chapter 04 The Commander Who Built a City in the Earth, 1948 to 1966. Cu Chi and Saigon, South Vietnam. The man who oversaw the transformation of the tunnel system from a series of escape routes into a functional underground military command was Pham Sang. A southern Vietnamese revolutionary who had been active in the resistance since the war against French colonial rule, Pham Sang served as political commissar of the Cu Chi district. He oversaw both the military operations and the ideological discipline that kept thousands of tunnel fighters committed to years of subterranean warfare. He understood that the tunnels were not merely tactical, they were psychological. A statement that no army, however powerful, could own ground that another people had decided to hold. Pham Sang faced an impossible administrative problem. How do you organize, supply, and maintain discipline among a fighting force living underground, cut off from daylight, under constant threat of gas attacks, collapse, flooding, and discovery? His answer was structure. Rigid, disciplined, almost bureaucratic structure imposed on a world of total darkness. The tunnel system was divided into zones. Each zone had its own command, its own supply chain, and its own defensive apparatus. Triple-layered trap doors concealed beneath cooking fire pits, false tunnel branches designed to lead intruders into collapse zones, sealed chambers where poisonous animals had been placed deliberately. The Americans estimated the tunnels at 60 kilometers. Pham Sang knew the true number was more than 4 times that. He never told them. He never had to. Chapter 05. The Decision to Disappear. 1965. Cu Chi District, South Vietnam. By 1965, living above ground in Cu Chi District had become a form of slow suicide. Operation Ranch Hand was systematically defoliating the jungle canopy using Agent Orange. The Strategic Hamlet program was relocating entire rural communities. Informant networks were being cultivated aggressively, and the Huey helicopter had made the concept of a safe zone nearly obsolete. Nguyen Thiet Dinh, deputy commander of the South Vietnam People's Liberation Armed Forces, understood the calculus clearly. Born in Bến Tre province in 1920, she had been organizing armed resistance since the 1940s. By 1965, she held effective command authority over guerrilla operations across the South. Her strategic directive was unambiguous. The surface belongs to the Americans. Everything below it belongs to us. The directive went down the chain to every district commander, every village cell, every fighter who had not yet committed fully to the underground. The consequences of the choice were spelled out without euphemism. Above ground, bombs, helicopters, defoliation, informants, and death on a timetable they could not control. Below ground, darkness, starvation rations, disease, suffocation, and the possibility of outlasting the most powerful army on Earth. Thousands of men and women chose the darkness. They went down, and the Earth closed over them, and they began to fight a war that the Americans could barely perceive. Chapter 06. Life Inside the Earth, 1966 to 1968. 3 levels below Cu Chi District. The tunnel system had 3 distinct levels. The first, shallowest level, roughly 10 feet down, was used for movement and communication. The second level, at 20 feet, held the living quarters, command posts, and supply caches. The third level, 30 feet or more below the surface, housed the most sensitive operations: field hospitals, weapons factories, printing presses. At 30 feet, a B-52 strike above ground registered as a low vibration in the walls. The Earth absorbed it. The laterite clay of Cu Chi Province, dense, moisture-resistant, remarkably stable, had turned out to be a natural blast buffer that no military engineer had predicted, and no bombing campaign could fully overcome. The fighters slept in shifts, 4 hours at a time, on bamboo platforms barely wide enough for one body. They ate cold rice. Cooking fires were permitted only when smoke could be channeled through dispersal vents opening hundreds of meters from any tunnel entrance, making the source untraceable. They operated without natural light for weeks at a time, navigating the passages entirely by touch and by the counting of steps memorized from their first day underground. Women delivered children in the hospital chambers on the second level. Couples married in underground ceremonies. A cultural troupe, musicians, singers, performers, toured the tunnel sections by lamplight, maintaining morale in a world where morale was the only resource that could not be resupplied from above. Dr. Vo Huang Le performed surgeries at the underground field hospital using instruments sterilized in boiled water, with kerosene lanterns held by nurses standing at angles calculated to throw maximum light on the operating field. The ceiling was 2 feet above the surgeon's head. Many patients survived, some did not. All of them were lowered into those operating chambers already knowing, if the Americans find this tunnel, there will be no evacuation. There will only be the sound of gas flooding the passages, and then silence. Chapter 07. The Man Who Went In Alone. January 1966. Cu Chi District, Operation Crimp. During Operation Crimp in January 1966, an American soldier named Sergeant Robert Batten made a decision that would define the rest of his life. The Tunnel Rats, as they came to be known, were not an organized unit. They were volunteers. Soldiers chosen initially because their bodies were small enough to fit through tunnel entrances that averaged 18 inches across. Often Hispanic American or Filipino American, selected for their stature, they were given minimal training and almost no specialized equipment. A .45 caliber pistol, a flashlight, sometimes a knife. They went in alone. Batten later described one encounter inside the Cu Chi tunnels that has since become one of the most cited accounts of close-quarters tunnel combat in military history. Moving in total darkness, navigating by his left hand pressed against the tunnel wall, counting his steps, he turned a corner in a passage barely wide enough for his shoulders and felt warm breath on his face. He could not see. The other person could not see. For a moment that Batten would later say felt completely outside of time, neither man moved. Then both moved at once. Batten survived. He came out of the tunnel in silence and reported what he had found. He was sent back in the next day. This was the face of the tunnel war. 2 human beings in absolute darkness, inches apart, fighting for ground that neither of them could see. Chapter 8. Tet. They came from under the street. January 30th to 31st, 1968. Saigon, South Vietnam. General Westmoreland had told the American public in November 1967 that the war was being won. He cited body counts, territory controlled, and the progressive degradation of Viet Cong fighting capacity. The numbers were real, the conclusion was not. On the night of January 30th, 1968, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year of Ton Ete, Viet Cong units launched coordinated surprise attacks on more than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam simultaneously. Among the targets, the United States Embassy in Saigon, the South Vietnamese Presidential Palace, Tan Son Nhut Air Base on the outskirts of the capital. American military intelligence had not predicted the scope of the offensive. The question they could not answer, the question that would haunt military analysts for years, was where the assault units had staged. How had thousands of fighters moved into position inside cities under heavy surveillance without being detected? The answer, in many cases, was the tunnels. Units that had been living underground in the suburbs of Saigon, in networks extending from Cu Chi District southward toward the capital, emerged through trapdoors in village homes, through false floors in market stalls, through openings concealed beneath the raised platforms of ordinary civilian kitchens. They had not infiltrated through the jungle. They had materialized from inside the city itself. The Tet Offensive did not achieve its military objectives. The Viet Cong suffered catastrophic losses in the open fighting that followed. But it achieved something more consequential than any tactical victory. It destroyed the credibility of the American government's assurances that the war was being won. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted newsman in America, broadcast from Vietnam in February 1968 and told his audience that the war appeared to be a stalemate. President Lyndon B. Johnson, watching from Washington, reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." He had, and the tunnels had helped lose it for him. Chapter 09. The War They Could Not See. 1969-1972. Cu Chi District and Washington, D.C. By 1969, the tunnel fighters were dying in new ways. President Richard Nixon had authorized the secret bombing of Cambodia, Operation Menu, severing many of the supply routes along the Ho Chi Minh Trail that fed the tunnel network. Agent Orange had stripped the jungle so thoroughly that above-ground movement was nearly impossible, even at night, and the tunnel rats had become more numerous, better organized, and increasingly effective. In some tunnel sectors, fighters were reduced to eating insects and boiled leather stripped from their own equipment. Medical supplies had run so low that surgeries were performed without anesthesia. Fighters with infected wounds died in the dark because there was nothing left to treat them with. And still, the tunnels held. Pham Sang maintained discipline through a combination of genuine conviction and absolute authority. Fighters who could no longer bear the darkness, the hunger, the loss of all physical sensation beyond pain were returned underground. There was nowhere else to go. Above ground was death. Below ground was survival, with conditions that made survival feel almost indistinguishable from the alternative. This was the final logic of the tunnel war, that suffering shared equally in the dark could outlast technology deployed from the light. Chapter 10. April 30, 1975. They emerged into the sun. April 30th, 1975. Saigon, South Vietnam. When North Vietnamese tanks rolled through the gates of the Independence Palace in Saigon on April 30th, 1975, and South Vietnam ceased to exist as a political entity, units that had spent years underground were among those who emerged into the daylight of a reunified country. Some of them had not seen sunlight in more than a year. The strategic impact of the Cu Chi tunnel network extended far beyond any individual battle. Military analysts at the Pentagon spent years after the war attempting to understand what the tunnels had demonstrated about the limits of technological superiority. The tunnels had proven that asymmetric resistance conducted underground with hand tools against the most advanced military apparatus on Earth could neutralize technological superiority through patience, concealment, and a willingness to absorb suffering that no conventional army could be expected to match. General Vo Nguyen Giap, the North Vietnamese commander who directed the overall strategy of the war, said afterward that the tunnels had not merely been a military asset, they had been a declaration, addressed not to the Americans alone, but to history. The statement read, "We are still here. You cannot find us. You cannot reach us. And when this is over, we will emerge." Chapter 11. The Mark on the Wall. Today, Cu Chi Tunnel's National Historical Site, Ho Chi Minh City. The Cu Chi Tunnels today are a museum, 25 miles from what is now called Ho Chi Minh City, the city that was Saigon. Visitors descend through an entrance widened to accommodate Western tourists who could not otherwise fit through the original opening. They crouch. They move through darkness for 3 minutes along a preserved section of passage. The ceiling presses down. The walls close in. The air carries the smell of old clay and something that might be imagination or might be history. The guides will tell you that Vo Thi Mo lived in tunnels like these for years, that Pham Sang commanded thousands of fighters from rooms you could not stand upright in, that children were born in these passages, that surgical instruments were sterilized in these chambers, that a cultural troupe performed music in these corridors while bombs detonated 30 feet above their heads. 3 minutes in the dark, then you emerge, blinking, into the tropical light. But somewhere along the preserved passage, if you look closely, you will see something the guides do not always mention. On the wall of the tunnel, in a section never enlarged, never repaired, never touched since the war ended, there are marks in the clay, the scrape of individual tools against ancient earth, preserved in the darkness exactly as they were left by hands that have been in the ground far longer than the tunnels themselves. You cannot know whose hands they were. You cannot know if they belonged to a farmer, a soldier, a surgeon, a mother, or a fighter who lay still in the dark while American boots walked across the ceiling above and waited with a patience the most powerful military on earth could not comprehend, for the moment when the boots would finally pass. The mark on the wall does not have a name. It does not need one. It is simply proof that someone was there in the darkness, in the earth, refusing to be found, and that they held.